This man built a billion-dollar company. Tonight nobody at this gate has no idea who he really is. Someone inside his own company is stealing millions, and he is about to do something no CEO has ever done. Nobody talks to the guard, which means the guard hears everything. Every Thursday night at the same hour, something disappears from this warehouse that was never supposed to leave. He is not Rare, the security guard. He is the CEO, and today, everyone finds out why he was really here. If you saw your own CEO standing at the front gate in a security guard's uniform, would you even recognize him? Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this story about a billionaire who traded his boardroom for a guard booth to catch the thieves hiding inside his own company is one you are not going to forget. Stay until the end, because the man they mocked, ignored, and tried to fire was about to bring their entire operation crashing down. Richard Hale was 45 years old, and for 22 of those years he had built Hale Dynamics from a single rented office into one of the largest logistics and manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples, a sharp jawline softened by warm brown eyes that missed nothing. Those who worked closely with him described him as quiet, watchful, a man who listened twice as much as he spoke. That habit of listening was about to save his company. It started with a single spreadsheet. Richard's finance director, a nervous young analyst named Priya Anand, had flagged an inconsistency in the warehouse division's inventory reports. Numbers that should have matched didn't. Shipments that should have arrived hadn't. Money that should have been there wasn't. When Priya brought it to the regional operations manager, a smooth-talking man named Gordon Castellan, she was told the discrepancy was a rounding error, nothing more. But rounding errors don't repeat themselves every month for 8 months, growing larger each time. Priya took the numbers straight to Richard, bypassing 3 layers of management to do it, an act that could have cost her the job if Richard had been the kind of executive who cared more about hierarchy than the truth. He was not. He sat in his glass-walled office on the top floor of Hale Tower, closed the blinds, and read every line of the report twice. By the time he finished, his jaw was tight, and his hands were still on the desk. Someone inside his own company was stealing from him, and worse, they were stealing from the thousands of employees whose pensions and livelihoods depended on Hale Dynamics staying honest and solvent. The easy path would have been to call in an outside auditing firm, hand them the numbers, and let lawyers handle it from a safe distance. Richard considered that path for exactly one night. He didn't sleep. He kept thinking about his father, a dock worker who had spent 30 years being underestimated by men in suits who never once asked his opinion before making decisions that affected his life. Richard had built his company on the promise that he would never become one of those men in suits, disconnected from the floor, blind to what was actually happening in his own warehouses. If corruption was rooted in Hale Dynamics, he was not going to find it from behind a mahogany desk. He was going to have to walk the floor himself, unseen. That night, Richard sat alone in his kitchen long after the house had gone quiet, turning the report over in his hands as though staring at it long enough might change what it said. He thought about the early years of Hale Dynamics, when the company was small enough that he knew every employee's name and their spouse's, Senen's name, and sometimes even their kids' birthdays. Back then, if something felt wrong on the floor, he would hear about it before lunch. Somewhere between 300 employees and 30,000, that closeness had eroded into layers of management, quarterly reports, and dashboards that reduced human beings to line items. He had told himself for years that the dashboards were simply the price of scale, but sitting there that night, he wondered how much had been quietly rotting beneath the surface, while he trusted the numbers on a screen instead of the people who generated them. His wife, Elena, found him still sitting there near midnight and asked what was wrong. Richard rarely brought work home, and she knew instantly that something had shifted. He told her everything, the discrepancies, Priya's courage in bringing them forward, his gut feeling that this was bigger than a clerical error. Elena, a former public school teacher who had never been shy about challenging her husband's blind spots, sat down across from him, poured them both a small glass of water instead of the wine he probably wanted, and listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, the way she used to listen to a struggling student explain a problem they didn't had, yet realize they already knew the answer to. Then she asked him a single question that stayed with him for days afterward. She asked him when the last time was that he had actually spoken to someone who worked in one of his warehouses, not a regional manager, not a vice president, but an actual person loading actual trucks. Richard could not answer her. He realized, sitting at his own kitchen table, that he did not know. The next morning, Richard called only 2 people into his confidence. Priya, whose integrity had already been proven, and his longtime head of security, a retired Marine named Walt Okafor, who had guarded Richard's family for over a decade and had never once leaked a secret. Richard told them his plan, and both of them thought he was out of his mind. Walt, in particular, argued for nearly an hour. A CEO with his face on the company's annual report, walking the loading docks in a rented uniform, someone would recognize him within a week. Richard's answer was simple. Nobody looks twice at a security guard. People look through guards, not at them. He had noticed that fact his entire life, ever since he'd watched executives walk past his father at the docks without so much as a nod. Invisibility, he said, was the greatest disguise a rich man could wear. Walt eventually agreed, on one condition. He would personally vet the cover story and make sure it held up under scrutiny. Within a week, a new employee file appeared in the Hale Dynamics HR system. His name was Ray Holt, 44 years old, a former warehouse supervisor from out of state, recently relocated, looking for steady work. The file included a fabricated employment history, references who would vouch for him if anyone called, and a driver's license with Richard's Ben's photograph under a name nobody in the company would recognize. Richard shaved the silver from his beard, wore his hair differently, put on a pair of plain glasses, and for the first time in over 2 decades, stepped onto the floor of his own company as an anonymous man in a rented uniform. The Redmond Distribution Center, the largest of Hale Dynamics' 12 regional warehouses, was where the irregular numbers had originated. It employed nearly 300 people across 3 shifts, moving freight for some of the biggest retail chains in the country. Richard's first day as Ray Holt began at 5 in the morning, standing at the employee entrance checking badges in the cold, his breath fogging in front of him, his hands stiff around a clipboard that felt heavier than any boardroom folder he had ever carried. Nobody said good morning to him. Nobody looked him in the eye. Trucks rolled through the gate, forklifts beeped in the yard, and workers shuffled past in the gray dawn light with the exhausted, guarded expressions of people who had learned not to expect kindness from whoever was standing at that gate. It stung more than Richard expected. This was his company. These were his people, and to them he was furniture. By his second week, the invisibility began to work in his favor. Guards, it turned out, heard everything. They heard the drivers complaining about shipments that mysteriously vanished between the manifest and the loading bay. They heard warehouse workers grumbling about overtime that never showed up on their paychecks, even though the time clock said they'd worked it. They heard supervisors on cell phones in the parking lot, voices dropping low when a black SUV that didn't belong to any of the retail clients rolled up at odd hours, always at night, always leaving within 20 minutes. Richard began keeping a small notebook, the kind any guard might use to log visitors, except his notes went far beyond visitor logs. He tracked which supervisor was on shift every time the black SUV appeared. He tracked which loading bay doors were opened during those visits, which shipments were logged as damaged and written off, and which employees seemed unusually nervous around Gordon Castellan, the regional operations manager Priya had first grown suspicious of. Gordon was a fixture at Redmond, a man in his early 50s with a salesman's K's smile and an expensive watch that didn't match his stated salary. He walked the floor like he owned it, greeting drivers by name, slapping backs, handing out gift cards around the holidays that came, curiously, not from the company's approved rewards program. Workers who crossed him quietly disappeared from the schedule within weeks, transferred to worse shifts, or let go for reasons that were never quite clear. Workers who stayed loyal to him were rewarded with lighter workloads, ignored write-ups, and bonuses that appeared in cash rather than through payroll. Richard watched all of this from his post at the gate, and later from a rotating assignment on the stalled loading dock that Walt had arranged for him, always making sure Ray Holt's schedule put him near whatever area needed the closest eyes that week. It was grueling work. Richard's back ached in ways his executive life had never demanded. His hands blistered from lifting crates. He stood 12-hour shifts in the summer heat that turned the metal warehouse into an oven, and in the winter cold that cut through the thin company-issued jacket. For the first time in over 20 years, Richard Hale understood, in his body and not just his spreadsheets, exactly what he was asking of the people who worked for him every single day. There were nights, in those first 2 weeks, when Richard genuinely doubted whether he could keep the charade going. His body, accustomed to leather office chairs and quiet conference rooms, rebelled against 12 hours on concrete floors. He came home to his rented apartment with his knees aching and his knuckles split from crate edges, and more than once he caught himself reaching for his phone to call Walt and end the brisance. Operation Early. What kept him going wasn't stubbornness alone. It was the growing list of small, human details he was collecting that no financial report could ever have captured. The forklift driver who quietly skipped his own lunch break twice a week to cover for a coworker, recovering from surgery. The night shift supervisor who kept a drawer of granola bars for anyone who showed up too rushed to eat breakfast. The teenage summer hire who still called every guard sir, no matter how many times they told him not to bother. These were the people Hale Dynamics actually ran on, and Richard was ashamed at how little he had known about any of them until he stood beside them in the cold. It was during those long shifts that Richard met Denise Alvarez, a single mother of 2 who had worked the loading dock for 6 years and trained nearly every new hire that came through Redmond, including the man she knew only as Ray. Denise was sharp, funny, and fiercely protective of the people under her informal wing. She noticed things too. She'd noticed the pattern with the black SUV long before Richard arrived, and she'd noticed that every worker who asked questions about it eventually stopped asking, either because they were threatened or because they were paid to look the other way. Denise took a chance on Ray Holt in a way most of the warehouse hadn't taken a chance on anyone in years. She showed him the ropes, warned him quietly which supervisors to avoid, and one evening, over cheap coffee in the break room after a double shift, she told him something that changed the entire direction of Richard's investigation. She said that 6 months earlier, her cousin, a driver named Marcus, had been fired within 48 hours of mentioning to a coworker that he thought certain damaged pallets were being resold rather than destroyed. Marcus had never been given a real explanation. His termination letter cited a vague policy violation. When he tried to file a complaint through the official HR channel, the complaint mysteriously never reached anyone above Gordon's level, because Gordon himself had inserted a procedural rule 2 years earlier requiring all Redmond complaints to be reviewed by the regional office before escalation to corporate. A rule, Richard now realized with a cold feeling in his stomach, that had been quietly approved by corporate without anyone questioning why a single regional manager needed that kind of gatekeeping power. Richard spent that night in his apartment, a modest 1-bedroom he'd rented under the Ray Holt identity to maintain his cover, staring at his notebook until 3 in the morning. The picture was coming together. Gordon Castellan had built himself a small, isolated kingdom inside Redmond, insulated from oversight by a policy he'd engineered himself, protected by loyal supervisors who benefited from looking away, and enforced through quiet intimidation of anyone who asked the wrong questions. The black SUV, Richard now suspected, wasn't dropping something off. It was picking something up. Goods marked as damaged, written off the books, and resold through a side channel that never touched Hale Dynamics' official ledgers. Every truckload skimmed was a loss absorbed silently by the company, buried under a line item called shrinkage that nobody at corporate had ever bothered to question closely enough. The next morning, Richard called Priya from a burner phone during his lunch break, sitting in his car in the employee parking lot in his guard uniform, feeling more like a stranger in his own life than he ever had before. Priya had been quietly pulling financial records from her position at corporate, cross-referencing the damaged goods, write-offs against insurance claims and disposal invoices. The numbers didn't match. Disposal invoices existed for maybe 60% of what was being written off as damaged. The other 40%, worth an estimated 2.2 chans, $3 million over the past 18 months, simply vanished from the paper trail entirely. Richard knew he had enough to act, legally and definitively, but he also knew that moving too fast risked losing evidence, or worse, risked Gordon destroying records and disappearing before real accountability could reach him. So Richard did something that surprised even Walt. He stayed undercover a full 3 more weeks, not to gather more evidence, but to understand who else was involved, and crucially, who wasn't. He had learned enough in his years running the company to know that the easiest mistake in a surge corruption case was punishing an entire team for the sins of a few, sweeping up loyal, hard-working people alongside the guilty ones simply because they'd been standing nearby. Those 3 weeks confirmed what Richard suspected. Of the roughly 40 employees at Redmond who reported into Gordon's chain, only 5 were actively participating in the scheme. Gordon himself, 2 shift supervisors named Aldo Ferris and Bianca Ostrowski, who falsified the damage logs, a warehouse security lead named Trevor Nash, who made sure the SUV visits went unrecorded on the official gate log, and an outside contact who ran the resale operation, a man named Curtis Vale, who Richard eventually photographed loading pallets directly from Bay 7 into the SUV at 11:40 on a Thursday night, using a burner phone camera Walt had smuggled to him. Everyone else at Redmond, Denise included, had simply been living inside a culture of fear that Gordon had carefully cultivated, afraid to speak up because they'd watched what happened to people who did. That distinction mattered enormously to Richard. This wasn't a story about a corrupt company. It was a story about a company where a small number of people had corrupted the system and terrorized the good people around them into silence. Those good people deserved protection, not suspicion. With Priya's financial trail, Walt's photographic evidence, and Richard's own first-hand documentation of 8 weeks on the floor, they had built an airtight case. Richard made 2 final decisions before revealing himself. First, he would give the evidence to an outside forensic accounting firm and independent legal counsel, not his own internal legal department, to ensure no one inside the company could quietly bury the findings. Second, he would confront Gordon not from behind a desk, but from the same floor where the theft had happened, in front of the very people who had lived under Gordon's rule for years. The reveal happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, during the shift change when nearly the entire Redmond staff overlapped for 20 minutes in the main yard. Richard, still in uniform, walked to the small stage area normally used for safety briefings, and asked, in Ray Holt's familiar voice, for everyone's attention. Gordon, standing near the coffee station with his usual easy smile, rolled his eyes, assuming some guard was about to make an announcement about parking violations. Richard removed his guard cap. He unclipped the laminated Ray Holt badge from his uniform and set it on the podium. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his real identification, the one with his actual name and the Hale Dynamics executive photo that every employee had seen on the company's annual report and welcome materials for years. A ripple of confused murmuring spread through the crowd as recognition dawned, first on the faces closest to the stage, then rolling backward through the yard like a wave. "My name is Richard Hale," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent yard. "I've been working here for the past 8 weeks as Ray Holt, a security guard. I did that because 8 weeks ago, I learned that someone inside this company was stealing from all of you, and I needed to see it with my own eyes before I could stop it." Gordon's smile had vanished. His face had gone pale, then red, his eyes darting toward the gate as if calculating an exit. Richard continued, laying out the evidence plainly. The falsified damage logs, the resale operation running out of Bay 7, the $3 million in losses absorbed silently for 18 months, and the culture of intimidation that had punished honest workers like Marcus for simply asking questions. He named Gordon, Aldo, Bianca, and Trevor directly, and as he did, 2 men in plain clothes who had been standing quietly near the gate all morning, private investigators hired through the outside legal counsel, stepped forward to formally detain them for the authorities who were already en route. Gordon tried for a moment to salvage the situation the only way he knew how, with charm. He raised his hands and laughed, told the crowd this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding, that he had run Redmond honestly for 11 years and wasn't about to be smeared by a rich man playing dress-up for a publicity stunt. But the laugh died in his throat when Richard calmly asked Trevor Nash, standing pale near the fence line, whether he wanted to explain to everyone why the gate logs showed no vehicle entries between 10 and midnight on 11 separate Thursdays, despite the loading dock cameras. Cameras Gordon did not know corporate had quietly upgraded and rerouted to an off-site server 2 years earlier as part of an unrelated security modernization project, clearly showing the same black SUV each time. Trevor said nothing. He simply stared at the ground, and in that silence, the last of Gordon's composure cracked completely. The yard erupted, not in anger at Richard, but in a strange, overwhelming release. Workers who had spent years afraid to speak, now shouting questions, some crying, some simply standing in stunned silence as the men who had controlled their working lives for years were walked toward a corporate security vehicle in handcuffs, cooperating with local police, who arrived minutes later to begin the formal arrest process. Denise found Richard afterward, standing near the loading dock where she had trained him weeks earlier, still in his rented uniform, looking, for the first time since she'd known him, deeply exhausted rather than composed. She didn't yell at him for the deception. She hugged him, hard, the way you hug someone after a long fight is finally over, and told him that her cousin Marcus deserved to hear this news personally, from Richard himself. In the weeks that followed, Hale Dynamics conducted a full, independent review of every regional facility, not just Redmond, uncovering 2 smaller but similar schemes at other locations that were dealt with swiftly and transparently. Marcus was reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology. Denise was promoted to a newly created role overseeing worker welfare and internal reporting across all 12 distribution centers, a role she had unofficially been performing out of sheer decency for years without ever being paid or recognized for it. Priya was named the company's first chief integrity officer, with direct reporting access to the board, specifically designed so that no single regional manager could ever again insulate themselves from oversight the way Gordon had. The day Marcus returned to Redmond was, by Richard's own admission afterward, one of the proudest of his career. Richard insisted on being there personally. No cameras, no press release, just Richard, Denise, and Priya standing at the same gate where Richard had checked badges for 8 cold weeks. Marcus walked in wearing the same faded work jacket he'd worn the day he was fired, visibly unsure of his welcome, and Richard walked straight up to him, shook his hand, and apologized on behalf of the entire company for the 18 months Marcus had spent unemployed, doubted, and quietly blacklisted by a system that should have protected him the moment he spoke up. Richard handed him not just his back pay, but a written commitment, signed personally, that any Hale Dynamics employee who reported wrongdoing in good faith would have a direct, protected line to the Chief Integrity Officer's office, one that no regional manager could ever again intercept or bury. Marcus, who had spent a year and a half believing that speaking the truth had cost him everything, stood at that gate and cried, and so, quietly, did Richard. Gordon, Aldo, Bianca, and Trevor faced criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, and Hale Dynamics pursued full financial restitution through the courts. Curtis Vale's resale operation was shut down entirely, and the investigation that followed helped authorities uncover a similar scheme he had been running with 2 other companies in the region, meaning Richard's decision to go undercover ended up protecting far more workers than just his own. Richard never went back to being just a name on an annual report. He kept his Ray Holt badge in a drawer in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Twice a year afterward, without warning, he still spent a week on the floor of a different Hale Dynamics facility, unannounced, in uniform, listening. Not because he suspected corruption everywhere, but because he had learned something in those 8 weeks at Redmond that no financial report could ever have taught him, that the truth of a company doesn't live in its spreadsheets or its boardrooms. It lives on the floor, in the tired hands and quiet conversations of the people doing the actual work, and any leader who stops listening to them is only one blind spot away from losing everything he claims to have built. Years later, when business students asked Richard Hale what the single most important decision of his career had been, he never mentioned an acquisition or a product launch. He told them about a cold morning at a warehouse gate, standing in a uniform that wasn't his, checking badges for people who had no idea who he really was, and how that single act of humility had saved his company from the inside out. Leadership, he would tell them, isn't about being seen from the top. It's about being willing, every once in a while, to disappear into the bottom and truly see. Denise still tells the story of Ray Holt to every new hire she trains, though now she tells it with Richard's blessing and, more often than not, with Richard standing quietly at the back of the room, arms crossed, letting her tell it her way. She always ends it the same way. She says that the measure of a leader isn't what he says in front of cameras or shareholders, but what he's willing to do when nobody, not one single person, knows who he really is. Ray Holt could have walked away after 2 weeks. He could have handed the evidence to lawyers and let them handle the rest from a safe distance. Instead, he stayed, blistered his hands, froze at that gate every morning for 8 weeks, and earned the trust of people who had every reason in the world not to trust another man in a uniform, standing between them and the truth. Hale Dynamics today is a very different company than it was before that Tuesday morning in the South Redmond yard. Every regional facility now runs an anonymous reporting line reviewed weekly by the board itself, not by regional management. Every new supervisor completes a mandatory course on ethical leadership taught, in part, using Richard and Denise's own account of what happened at Redmond. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Richard revealed himself, Hale Dynamics closes for exactly 1 hour across all 12 facilities, not for a corporate celebration, but for something Richard insisted on personally, an open-floor meeting at every single warehouse, where any employee, from the newest hire to the plant manager, can stand up and say whatever needs to be said, directly, with no fear of consequence, and with Richard, whenever his schedule allows, standing somewhere in the crowd rather than on a stage, listening. That, in the end, is the story's real lesson, the one Richard Hale carried with him long after Sathin. The headlines faded, and the court proceedings concluded. Power has a way of insulating people from the very truths they need most. Titles, corner offices, and executive parking spots can quietly become walls instead of privileges, cutting a person off from the floor where the real work and the real risk actually happens. It took a cold morning at a gate, a rented uniform, and the courage of one young analyst who refused to let a suspicious spreadsheet die quietly in a drawer to remind a billionaire that the truest test of leadership isn't how well you work, well seen from the top of the company. It's how closely you're willing to look from the bottom, where the people who make everything possible are so often the last ones anyone thinks to ask.